Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Carnegie Middle East. Today, we have a panel on the Syrian-Turkish border in the aftermath of the devastating earthquake that happened almost 40 days ago. And these days also mark the 13th anniversary of the Syrian uprising for freedom and equality against Bashar al-Assad. And we have 4 speakers, including myself. My name is Seda Altug. I'm an assistant professor at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. We have Emma Beals. Beals is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. She's an independent consultant focused on Syria. And we have Sinan Hatahet. He's a senior associate fellow at Amran for Strategic Studies and an associate researcher for the European University Institute in Italy. And Armenak Tokmajyan is our last speaker. He's an Aryan Fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and his research focuses on borders and conflict, Syrian refugees, and state-society relations on Syria. So we will each talk almost approximately around 10 minutes, and then we have a Q&A session where you can write your questions, and please indicate to whom you refer to in your questions. So as I have just said, today is the 14th day of the huge earthquake centered in Maraş, in one of the cities in Turkey, and it took place on the 6th of February. It affected almost 14 million people, both in Turkey and Syria, and it led to a huge destruction, a death toll of thousands, almost 60,000, both in Turkey and Syria in total, and also huge destruction of human-made environment, residential buildings, public and government buildings, roads, bridges, airports, etc. And I mean, it was an horrible tragedy. And first of all, I would like to say condolences to people, to people who lost, to the relatives of those people who lost their lives, and also express my solidarity and support for the earthquake victims living in the earthquake region. So the epicenter of the earthquake was Maraş, a city located on the western part of the Euphrates River, and it took place all the way, it affected all the way, the fault line went all the way from Maraş, Antakya, Adıyaman, and then crossed the border. Of course, natural disasters don't recognize nation-state borders. It went all the way to Azaz, Afrin, and the Syrian coastal region. So on the first days of the earthquake, on the Turkish part, the rescue and relief aid and donation operations were were full of mismanagement and misorganization on the part of the Turkish government's official aid agency called AFAD in Turkish. It is the abbreviation for Disaster and Emergency Management Authority. So there was criticism against the government relief efforts by the locals, by the victims, especially in the first couple of days, where the rescue operations, where it was quite critical days for the rescue operations to save the lives of people who stayed under the rubbles. Yet at the same time, there was a huge NGO presence in the earthquake region, from Maraş to Antioch, to Hatay in Turkish, Antioch and Alexandretta, Adıyaman, Diyarbakır, Urfa, Antep, and Kilis, it actually affected 10 cities. So the earthquake region actually consists of 10 cities in Turkey. So lots of NGO presence, lots of political parties, oppositionary or otherwise, human rights organizations or other kinds of human organizations were quite present in the region, doing the aid and donation distribution as well as the rescue operations. However, there was at the same time an increasing centralization of relief efforts by AFAD in order to encounter the criticisms against the absence of government in the earthquake region. So starting from almost day 3, we see that the relief efforts have been centralized, and what we see is that more dispersed and more decentralized NGO efforts have started to be appropriated by the Disaster and Emergency Management Authority of the official one, and these are mainly the allegations of the part NGOs involved in the relief efforts in the southern part of Turkey. Lots of rumors about corruption, lots of appropriation, and lots of criticisms, and this becomes more problematic, especially after the rescue operations by cranes, by electric equipment or by excavators have come to a halt, and almost I think even on the 10th day there were some people being rescued. So then starts the distribution of tents, the distribution of other kinds of donations, medical expenses, the issue of burying of the corpses, the issue of the DNA, missing people, and then starting from the 10th day, and now that even that phase of burial of the dead bodies have almost, not fully though, terminated, and matching of DNAs and have not come to a halt, have not finished, but is about to finish now. So there were also at those times in the second phase, there was a lot of discussion about the funerals, about the missing people, and about respect to the dead. And one other debate that was quite vocal, both in the government, pro-government media, and also in the opposition media, was this discussions about construction issues in Turkey, the earthquake regulations, the post 1919 earthquake regulation, and the corruptions in the applications of that regulation in the constructions, because during the earthquake, as you could, I believe, followed on the news, various residential buildings, public buildings, and roads and others have been fully destructed. So there was discussion about corruption, about construction licenses, about the earthquake tax, the compulsory earthquake tax that was levied, that was imposed after the big earthquake that took place in Izmit, a city close to Istanbul, in 1999, and the role or the complicity of the governments and municipalities, government departments and municipalities giving permissions, giving construction licenses, and issuing construction amnesties, especially for political tools. So there is still an ongoing discussion in across the country about construction as the basis of economic growth and the corruption in the construction industry. And coming to the Syrian refugees or Syrian citizens living in Turkey, I think we do not have official figures but half of the Syrians living in Turkey live in the earthquake region, actually. So Syrians were as much as the non-Syrian Turkish citizens and I mean Syrian refugees and citizens were as badly as affected as the Turkish citizens, but perhaps more as mainly because Syrian refugees or citizens, Syrians in Turkey live in, I mean, 60% of them live under the poverty and live in poverty conditions. So they live in buildings, mainly, I mean, in weakly constructed buildings, in, informal settlements. So the Syrian misery has exponentially increased with the earthquake. I think it would not be an exaggeration to argue so. And in addition to Syrian misery due to the earthquake, what we see, especially in the first days of the earthquake, is the scapegoating of Syrians in the earthquake victim Syrians with theft, with rape, and with looting, unfortunately. So the victims of the earthquake, of the Syrian victims of the earthquake, are accused with such accusations, and this was mainly organized by a Turkish political party, and the anti-Syrian discourses and racism against Syrians was, especially in the early days, was quite on the increase. When it comes to the restrictions on movement of Syrians, as several people, the victims, were trying to leave the quake region, and either on their own or in an organized manner by the official aid agency, Turkish state's official aid agency. What we see is that in the early days, I think starting from the second day of the earthquake, if I'm not wrong, or the third day, what we see is that the Syrians were given a travel permit to travel outside the earthquake region and register in the immigration office of the new city or the district that they arrived to. And they were allowed to stay for 60 days, for almost 3 months in the new site, in the new city that they arrived to. However, this law, this regulation, this amendment of giving travel permit for 60 days was later slightly changed changed as such. So those Syrians who live in the worstly affected 5 cities are allowed to travel with a travel permit. Without a travel permit, those who live in the lesser affected 5 cities were allowed to travel only with a travel permit. So obviously, when it comes to the aid and rescue, aid and donation, we see that the ongoing policies are vis-a-vis the Syrian refugees, especially in the camps, were not very sustainable, and there were problems with access to water, with access to education. And there were allegations of violations, especially such as taking the earthquake aid from them, removing them from shelters, and lots of other problems when it comes to housing, food, medical services, as well as legal papers. And the problems about housing, food, medical services, and legal papers apply to the Syrians living in the earthquake region, but other problems and other problems that Syrians face in their new cities, in the new after their displacement, is basically the law, the legal restriction regarding the duration of their stay, and secondly, according to the Turkish law, Syrians are not allowed to stay in certain neighborhoods, such where the basically the Turkish state tries to ease the pressure of Syrians, the Syrian visibility in certain neighborhoods, in certain cities in Western Turkey. So this pressure easing strategy was also a hindrance against Syrians in their new cities regarding, again, housing, education, and employment opportunities. So this is the general situation that earthquake victims, Syrians and locals have been facing. Now I would like to give the word to Sinan, where he is going to talk about the issue of demography and after the earthquake. The floor is yours, Sinan.
Thank you, Seda. And I would like to apologize for maybe a little bit the lack of energy, but I feel a little bit under the weather. But hopefully, I will be as concise as insightful as possible. So, looking at this question of the demographic impact of the earthquake, we need, of course, to have more time in order to be able to look at different metrics and different questions and see what were the real impacts. Some of them are short period, and some of them are a little bit longer. But usually we look at four different questions. The first one is population displacement. How many people have been displaced from one area to another? In this particular instance is how many Syrians have left their home or their new acquired home in Turkey as refugees, or new acquired homes as IDPs from northern Syria, and where they have moved to. So there is a question how many, but also try to understand the pattern of movement, where they have moved to one area and why they have moved to this area other than another one. And here we have some early answers. The second one, second metrics or question that we need to look at is migration. Usually also a network can lead to long-term migration patterns, as people may move permanently to other regions, to other countries in this case, especially for Syrians that are already living in precarious conditions in Syria and in Turkey. There is also a lot of them who are asking themselves the question of whether they can sustain their presence in Turkey or not. And the third question, which will unfortunately take more time but is very important, is the age and gender composition in the earthquake hit areas. Earthquake can have differential impacts on different age and gender groups. For example, children and elderly people may particularly be vulnerable to the impact of earthquake, especially when it comes to healthcare and education, while women at the same time may face specific challenges in terms of access to resources, services, and jobs. And it is important to remember that Syrian women, whether in Syria or in Turkey, face a lot of challenges in accessing the job market. Fourth one, and this one is already undergoing, is to assess actually what kind of impact it had on the housing and the infrastructure. Here is pretty straightforward. We have to count the type of damage that was endured on housing and infrastructure, and what will be the long-term impacts of these changes on the demography of an area. For example, if a large number of houses are destroyed, this may lead to a reduction in population in the city in certain affected areas. Similarly, if key infrastructure such as hospitals or schools are damaged, then this may affect the ability of people to access services and resources. And this is specifically important, for example, in areas like in Afrin, where there are also a demographic uh, uh, cleansing, quote unquote, uh, um, uh, also dimension, where the local Kurdish community is facing a lot of pressure, and some of them are being submitted into leaving or selling their houses, or even simply are subject to threats by different armed groups. So, in areas like this, the earthquake can have a multiplier effect, creating further damage on the demographic tissue of the area. So, coming back to the first question of population displacement. So, within the few days that after the earthquake, in addition of, as Seda said very well, in addition of the Turkish government allowing Syrians with temporary protection status to travel in Syria as long as they are from an impacted area, there was also another directive issued, which was allowing Syrians to come back to to Syria. Usually, this happens during the Eid period, in which they allow specific the Syrians that resides in Idlib or have family in Idlib or in Azaz to leave for a few days, usually a week or two. So this was reconducted during the just after the aftermath of the earthquake, uh, and Syrians were allowed to move back to Syria. Let me give you some simple actually numbers, because these numbers we were able to get from data that is being published by the Syrian interim government, as well the Syrian Salvation Government, and also the Directorate of the border crossing. Just a second. So around 40,000 people have came back to Syria. Half of them have came through Bab el Hawa, or a little bit than half of them, around 55% through Bab el Hawa. So basically meaning that they came back to Idlib, and around 40% came back through Tal Abyad, or actually, which is from the Turkish point of view, is from Shanli Orfa. So we had the basic two movement happened between Hatay to Idlib, and between Shanli Orfa to Tel Abyad, or actually, and there was then the other 5%, or a little bit less than 5%, came through Azaz. If we look at the destruction level that happened in the respective areas in Syria, Idlib was the one that was hit the most, especially Bab el Hawa areas, which is Harim, Salqin, and Armenak, and this is where the majority of Syrian IDPs also reside. So the fact that we have this Syrian people returning to this region is a little bit surprising, because the infrastructure is not able to accommodate them. We conducted some research interviews, and what came to us is basically that these Syrians were actually from the poorer classes, or the Syrians that were living in more difficult, let's say, conditions in Hatay, and didn't afford to move to another Turkish wilaya or Turkish province. And for them, the best solution for them was to return to Hatay. This was, sorry, to Idlib. This was taking consideration that there was no official or NGOs that were taking care of financing, of finding also resources to help this impacted Syrians inside of Turkey. There have been, of course, some initiatives launched by the Syrian local communities in Turkey, but there was mostly, on a small scale and for family members. So and it wasn't, and the poorer Syrians were not be able to benefit from these small initiatives. So the solution to return to Idlib was a solution based totally taken by financial considerations. For Azaz, even though Azaz has been relatively spared by the earthquake, with only few buildings been affected by the earthquake, it was one of the regions that hosted the less of IDPs, either from Syria or returning refugees. And also here, after conducting some interviews, the reasons was it seems that the local administration, especially the local council, was against hosting a new IDP communities inside the city, knowing that the city has already around 11 to 12 IDP camps, large camps, not small camps. It's not shelter camps, it's large camps that in total constitute around 200,000 people. So also we have the local communities that have not necessarily showing lack of solidarity, but showing, but basically coming to the limit of the ability to help and to host. In Tal Abyad, the returnees also came. A lot of them came from basically fear of reprisals. There was also, in addition to what Seda mentioned in terms of anti-Syrian movement, rhetoric, there was attacks, and this was enough also to help and to move Syrians to return to Tal Abyad. The problem of the return of Tal Abyad, that Tal Abyad also has a very limited infrastructure. In Azaz or in Idlib, there are communities that are more or less, thriving in terms of construction, etc. But Tal Abyad is a region that has been practically isolated from the international society. There is no financial assistance to the region. There is no enough humanitarian aid being delivered to the region. It has been is exempted from a lot of the UN, also Western support mechanism to northern Western Syria. So it is a region that has also very little capacity to host new IDPs. I think that I'm moving toward the end of my presentation. I will mention that also the number of Syrian migrants has been on the rise, even though we don't really have statistics right now, but the numbers of them seeking legal migration to EU and the numbers of asylum demands has increased considerably after the earthquake. Germany in particular has been issued a couple of new rules that lessen some of the conditions on Syrian immigration to the territory. And this is also a compounded effect of both the misery of Syrians inside of Syria, as well as the rising anti-Syrian sentiments in Turkey. Finally, there is maybe one statistics that we haven't mentioned so far, that 10% of the earthquake victims in Turkey are Syrians that carries only Syrian papers. That's around 4,600 people. But that doesn't include, of course, the Syrians that also have Turkish identities that have been nationalized in the last few years. But that's also considerably high. 10% of the earthquake victims in Turkey is Syrians, with 6,000 people also killed in Syria. That's, we say that around 10,000 Syrians have perished in this earthquake. This is it is actually the deadliest day in Syrian history when it comes to the number of casualties and number of martyrs. With that, I end my intervention. I hope that I was able to provide some insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sinan. Thank you very much for this presentation. So now I would like to give the floor to Emma Beals, who is going to talk about the humanitarian response to the earthquake tragedy. The floor is yours, Emma.
Thank you, and thanks to Carnegie for hosting this, timely event, and of course, obviously condolences to all of those who have both in Syria and Turkey who have lost loved ones in this absolutely tragic event. I think we've heard, about the situation in Turkey, and then also about, which population was where, and I'm going to talk a little about the humanitarian response in Syria. As we heard, this has come sort of 12 years into an uprising and subsequent war. Prior to the earthquake, humanitarian conditions were at their most extreme levels and all across Syria throughout the whole conflict. And a political settlement is further from view than ever. So it's really tragedy on top of tragedy. In Damascus, the response was actually surprisingly quick, given how isolated our regime held Syria has been for so long. So we saw planes coming in from Russia, Algeria, Iran, Iraq, and the UAE, all by the second day after the quakes, or the day after the quake. And they kept coming through the weeks that have followed. So by the end of that week, I think it was about 45 plane loads, 2,500 tons of goods had arrived. Rescue teams had arrived. And that has continued. The regime asked for help from the West pretty quickly, but initially only in the form of sanctions relief. And then after that was secured, I think the general license from the United States came through on the Thursday. They asked for help again from the EU through the civilian protection mechanism, and aid has arrived directly from the EU itself, and then from member states as well, on top of the regular assistance that is given by the EU and member states, and the US as well. Early complaints on social media from people living in those areas about, where was the aid going, or some irregularities with distributions, saw some of those people being arrested. And we have sort of seen the regime really try to get out in front of this response and try to control things. So they have consolidated humanitarian aid in warehouses under the purview of the regional committees underneath the Higher Relief Committee, not to include the UN or INGO goods, but that is given out through those committees. The damage assessments are done by the public safety committees, who have a whole range of people involved. And we have non-humanitarian actors like the chambers of industry and so on, engaging in relief efforts that are, of varying quality, shall we say. The regime has been really quick to conflate damage from the earthquake with damage from the conflict. And Assad has been very explicit about this in his meetings with high-level UN officials. You see that in the readouts. In his interview yesterday, I think it was, with Russia Today, while he was in Moscow, he claimed that the damage from the earthquake was 10 times the estimated amount of damage given by the World Bank's rapid damage assessment. He can very clearly see that there is much more goodwill toward funding recovery work in areas controlled by the regime, not just in the quake-affected areas, but across the country than there has been before, because, of course, reconstruction has previously been tied to progress on the political track, which he has been completely unwilling to engage in. But there are some major risks in how that will be done if there aren't changes in the approach that might be seen from humanitarians. The Northwest, on the other hand, has really struggled. As you know, most viewers are probably aware, the Northwest is accessed through something called the cross-border mechanism, which is under the auspices of a Security Council resolution that allows access into the Northwest by notification to the regime rather than by permission, because, of course, over the last 12 years, what we've seen is aid denial to those seen as opposed to the government as a strategy of the conflict. And that has continued because every time that resolution needs to be renewed, we've seen hugely fraught discussions going on. And what that meant is that after the earthquake, everybody basically panicked, despite the fact that there was a resolution in place. Sure, there were certainly logistical issues going on. You know, we didn't see assistance immediately arrive into Hatay because of some of the logistical concerns that there were. So there's, of course, some of the holdup in what happened in the Northwest is due to, you know, the chaos of the earthquake. In hindsight, of course, is a wonderful thing, but we did not see any assistance come into the Northwest until the 4th day, and that was pre-planned assistance. It wasn't quake-specific assistance. We saw the white helmets were the only people doing rescue work throughout the entire time that lives could have been saved. They've obviously got a huge amount of experience, but they have limited capacity, and we saw, you know, a lot of private giving, you know, individuals pouring money towards the white helmets and other small NGOs, but things like a lack of fuel, for example. You know, there's no amount of money in the world that can make up for a lack of a resource if you can't buy it. So they were really struggling. They needed more heavy machinery. They needed more manpower, and they did not receive it. It's easy to blame the UN, but I think we have to be clear that also, you know, there were a number of states mobilized in other areas of Syria and in Turkey, and none of them deployed into Northwest Syria unilaterally. Because of the previous threats to the end of cross-border in January, there were pre-positioned basic supplies there. So we didn't see like an immediate drop-off in, you know, food supplies or medicines. So in some ways, a perverse benefit of some of the complexities of the access arrangement was that there were supplies in the area while those bigger operations got back up and running. But, you know, in January, humanitarians in the area were already saying that there was a camp crisis, with 1.8 million of the 2 million IDPs in the Northwest living in tents and informal settlements, shelters. And that's before the conflict, before the earthquake, rather. So there are more people obviously displaced by the earthquake now. There was not any work going on really addressing that problem from the sort of international humanitarian system because of various policy constraints. So the Northwest was abandoned long before the earthquake, but they certainly felt abandoned afterwards. And as we heard, 40,000 Syrians around about have gone to the Northwest from Turkey over the last 40 or so days. Some will return back to Turkey, I'm sure. Others will stay, but that's a huge additional burden on an area that already has a huge shelter problem, already has a huge resource problem. There's a lot more to be said about the fact that assistance didn't reach the area in that first week, but I think it's hard to overstate the impact that has had. I mean, there's a tendency with these kind of disasters and conflicts to hope that it'll bring warring sides together, that there might be some sort of momentum available in the aftermath. But I think that first week was relatively defining in terms of whether that would happen or not. It had the opposite effect, and I think the impact of that is still underappreciated. It's impacting cross-line assistance, of course, and it will impact engagement on a political discussion as well, I think. We've seen UN personnel crossing into the Northwest, which we hadn't seen in a while. The regime did give permission for that the week after the earthquake, but no such permission is required because of the resolution. So they could have been going the whole time anyway. 2 additional crossings into the area from Turkey were allowed for the UN's use through a sort of agreement by the regime, but that's for a temporary period as well. But I think we saw like a precursor to what would happen if cross-border is not renewed in July, with some of those issues that we saw in the first week as well. I was reading back through yesterday some old material from 2014, from around the time that cross-border was originally approved. And we're sort of 9 years later having the same exact conversation, if not in a worse space, because we also need to think about, you know, previously the Northwest has been sort of dump and run from in terms of the response. There's, you know, we count trucks crossing the border under the UN system and they coordinate in Turkey, but it's small NGOs on the ground doing the work. But we need to really pivot now in that area to being able to address those shelter needs, address this huge strain on resources. So it's going to be a different kind of access that's needed in there as well than what we have seen over the last few years. In terms of funding, we saw funds really dwindling before the earthquake. We have a donor conference on Monday for both Turkey and Syria, and then another one in June for Syria, which is the regular donor conference. So Turkey has the correct system set up to deal with kind of IFIs and emergency funding. Syria doesn't. So aside from the political situation and sanctions and so on that would really make that challenging, Syria isn't in good standing with the World Bank, for example. So there's just complications on top of complications there. We haven't seen really any clarity from major donors about differentiating between quake versus conflict damage, what they are looking at in terms of what they might fund, what they won't fund. But we have seen a lot of push from the regime and push from UN agencies for a major pivot towards how they work, in particular in regime-held Syria. The Northwest needs this long-term work, of course, because we have these 2 million IDPs in a precarious shelter situation. So it's not even about rebuilding. There just wasn't necessarily something to rebuild in the first place. And then we have some ongoing discussion about potential support from some of the Arab states, from the UAE, from Saudi, and so on, and what terms that may or may not be provided under. So there's a lot of pressure on this conference on Monday. You know, the issue is that we're now talking about a major recovery, but Syria is entirely without any of the political reforms that would have enabled reconstruction funding. So it will either occur in an unreformed situation where it will take place in a way that, you know, major sort of recovery support in regime areas will mean that people can't return home. Think, you know, some of these structural problems that are why people are not presently living there will be baked in. Rights will be destroyed, particularly housing, land, and property rights. You know, so we may have some light infrastructure, but we will have sort of the underpinnings of the next conflict sort of mapped out. Because we've seen over the last decade a lot of reporting about some of the challenges in providing humanitarian assistance in Damascus and some of those core issues, but not much in the way of progress. So we saw, I think it was just last week, a piece from the Financial Times that highlighted, you know, the employment of Hassan Luka's daughter within a department that was looking after the earthquake funds. We also have the political complication that in less than 2 months, the discussion about these extra crossings into the north becomes live again at a time where they haven't necessarily even been able to be established properly in their use, you know, and to understand how much they are needed for recovery work. And then in July, we have the cross-border resolution up for renewal again. And I think that sort of the only way you could really do major additional harm to the people in the Northwest at this point, who are, you know, still really struggling with the aftermath of the earthquake, is to leave that cross-border negotiation to the last minute again, to be doing these 11th hour negotiations about whether they will even receive aid. And so we may or may not have UN staff able to enter that area to oversee the work, depending on their interpretation of whether there's of that renewal. There's a lot of donors who want to do more work in the Northwest, because of the quake, they've sort of realized how drastic the situation there is, and are perhaps becoming attuned to the idea that this needs to be longer term to work, but who are not grappling, are not able necessarily to grapple with how to deal with HTS or Afrin or any of the bigger political sort of discussions that need to be had in terms of being able to engage in that longer term funding in that area, either how to work around those issues or what quite to do. I mean, there's been one small piece of good news on the humanitarian front. I think it's important to flag some good news, which is that the cholera vaccination drive in the Northwest seems to have been going very well, particularly, you know, in light of the conditions. So many donors, though, unfortunately, that I've heard in the last couple of days, and so are looking at simply reorienting the money that they're providing to cover the quake as well. So we're back into this more with less kind of issue once again. We already had really dwindling funds. And we also have, of course, a relationship between the situation in Turkey, the funding of the recovery in Turkey and Syria, because Turkey will not only want assistance to rebuild in Turkey, but to ensure that it can manage its refugee hosting responsibilities, you know, going to need to look after the refugees that are in Turkey, and also to ensure that the Northwest becomes habitable and stable, and so that there isn't, you know, humanitarian conditions degrading there that actually increase the number of people wanting to leave the country. So we also can't differentiate entirely the concerns there on either side of the border. I'll probably wrap up there rather than going into sort of recommendations, but happy to jump back into recommendations later if that's helpful.
You're on mute, Seda, I think.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Emma. So abandonment and basically all kinds of cleavages have deepened, exponentially increased after the earthquake. Yeah. And our last speaker is Armenak Tokmajyan. He's going to talk about the rapprochement between Turkey and the Syrian regime and how it will potentially affect the border landscape. The floor is yours, Armenak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seda, and thank you, everyone. Given that I'm the house speaker here, welcome again. Thanks for accepting Carnegie's invitation. And thanks for our viewers for their interest. First of all, I think it's appropriate to extend condolences to those who have suffered from the earthquake, but also after, you know, more than 12 years of suffering in Syria, my sympathies to all those who've been affected, essentially. There isn't really an end in sight, unfortunately. Humanitarian crisis across Syria, and now even at the border across Turkey. So I'm not that optimistic, but let's hope that in a few years' time, at least things will improve. What I will do in my presentation, essentially, I will make a few points about the rapprochement between Turkey and the Syrian regime, how the earthquake impacted that, and eventually try to give a general sense on how could this impact on the border, on the Syria-Turkey border, especially on the Syrian part. So as you all know, about less than 2 months before the earthquake, which hit in February, Russia mediated a negotiation track between the regime and the Syrian regime and Turkey. Rather than perhaps negotiation is not the right word, it opened a rapprochement track, let's say. First of all, if we would look at the main motivations of why that occurred, I think there were internal reasons in Turkey to begin with. President Erdogan has internal struggle, especially in the context of the elections. So there was the internal dynamic, and I think that pressed AK party to open channels to the Syrian regime through Russia. But also there were security reasons related to the presence of Kurdish forces in the northeast and the ongoing, let's say, the ongoing crisis in the Turkish-US relations, at least in the context of the Kurdish issue in the northeast. So, so there were domestic and regional reasons that motivated Turkey, first of all, to decide to re-engage with Assad. Russia, of course, among the many reasons was to regain some sort of initiative in the Syria context after its dominant position in Syria was affected after the Ukraine war, and therefore bringing Turkey as a major regional power, which can really shift the dynamics in the Syrian conflict to the picture. It in a way resumed an important role, but also arguably, I think Russia has interest in keeping Erdogan or helping Erdogan stay in power. And the Syria file in the Turkish elections, we see that it's pretty important. Therefore, any major breakthrough between Turkey and Syria could potentially or arguably help Erdogan in his election campaign. Most interestingly, in my view, is Assad's regime's position. I would say, despite the posture that we've seen, Assad's position was quite weak before the earthquake. Economic crisis, isolation, and even the Arab track, which was supposed to regain Syria its chair in the Arab League, did not really did not really end up anywhere. But perhaps more importantly, Russia and Iran in the past year or two have probably signaled or made Assad understand that basically they are not really ready to support the Syrian army and the auxiliary forces to regain territory by force. So Russia, because of the Ukraine war, but also Iran for other considerations, they essentially they wouldn't help Assad to regain, quote unquote, every inch of Syria. So Assad's position was quite weak when it entered the rapprochement track with Turkey, except perhaps with one important factor: the fact that Erdogan needed, or at least arguably needed, Assad in its domestic context, but also to isolate the Kurdish forces in the northeast and increase pressure on the US on that matter. The earthquake, I would say, postponed this rather than changed radically the rapprochement track. The sheer size of the disaster, especially on the Turkish side, I think forced all political parties, including AKP and Erdogan, to they had to take a step back and focus on the disaster inside. So the track was frozen and postponed. Just a few days ago, we learned that they are back on track, and there will be. It looks like there will be meetings on senior diplomatic level. But let's ask the question: what earthquake changed in this rapprochement track? I would say Assad's position improved slightly. And the main reason for that is that, as Emma was mentioning, that Assad quickly and perhaps even surprisingly managed to capitalize on the earthquake financially and also politically. The Arab countries, especially UAE, led the charge in opening channels and turning the humanitarian disaster into a political capital. We saw movements from Egypt, from Oman, and other countries. So in a sense, Assad's position is slightly stronger, while again, arguably, I think Erdogan's position is a bit weaker, given the local pressure, as Seda was explaining at the beginning, the anti-governmental sentiment, the failure, at least partially, to respond quickly and effectively to the disaster. It weakened Erdogan's position. Nevertheless, I think overall, Turkey keeps its strong position in this rapprochement context, given that it has a lot of forces on the Syrian in the north of Syria. That's one. Second, this whole area in the northwest and the areas that come under Turkish protection or control, they are nourished basically through Turkey, through cross-border aid, but also through commercial activities. So not just these areas, but the entire, let's say, international community depends on Turkey in reaching to these areas. So Turkey has a lot of leverage, but Assad still holds this golden card, let's say, the only one, but quite a strong one, that he could spoil this whole rapprochement thing and spoil it for Turkey, spoil it for Russia, and not basically going to an agreement with Turkey. We don't know what will happen, but if there was a major agreement, my understanding or my take on this is that Assad will not go to any agreement with Erdogan, or let's say meet President Erdogan somewhere in Russia or some other place, unless he gets something tangible and something important that he can sell locally, he can benefit economically, and he can turn that into a bigger political capital. Otherwise, I don't see the motivation of the regime in going and shaking hands with their nemesis, basically, who's been supporting anti-Assad movement, whether civilian or military, in the past 12 years. So in short, if there is an agreement in this context of rapprochement, I think Assad will gain something. Finally, with 2 minutes, I think then the other question is, if that happens, what are the implications on the border region of northern Syria? And on that note, my colleague at Carnegie, Khaddour, and I, we just finalized a paper talking about this issue, raising this question, and it will come out in 2 weeks. I'm promoting the paper a little bit here. So we're taking that question and trying to answer what could be the implications of a major agreement between Syria and Turkey. And one of the answers, I'm not going to go too much into details, but I think we could be facing further cantonization of the border region of Syria's borderland. By cantonization, perhaps first we could give an operational definition to it. If we look at the Syrian borderland in the north, we have several locally rooted entities which essentially rule the area and remain outside regime's control, or largely outside regime's control, with foreign help. And with a population that they rule, which either cannot coexist with the regime, or they don't fit into regime's view of Syria. So basically, we could, if there was a major agreement between Turkey and the regime, we might see further cantonization of these areas, further adjustments of these regions, which will have major consequences on the population in the north, especially in the northwest. And what do we mean by further adjustment? Of course, it's difficult to say, but my understanding is that Assad would try to gain access to certain economic capital, and most importantly, certain border crossings in some shape or form. I'm not saying that they would retake the border crossings with Turkey, but would try to get more access and influence, at least on this economic resource. In another scenario, Assad would try to gain more territory especially in the northwest. And when it comes to the northeast, basically we might see some sort of a security understanding between a regime and Turkey, and in cooperation with Russia and perhaps even Iran, to increase pressure on SDF in the northeast. Having said that, and I will conclude on this note, we argue this in the paper, and it's important to mention that even if there was such an agreement, and even if Assad managed to reap some concessions, important concessions from Turkey, the dilemma is that the Damascus cannot absorb these areas which are outside its control, either physically, given the vast territory, but also demographically, given the presence of a large amount of Syrians who do not want regime rule, but also administratively and service-wise. Assad and his government have problem in serving even in the capital or in the second city in Aleppo. So let alone going and trying to provide basic services to areas. So in short, to wrap up, cantonization would mean a further influence of Assad on the border areas in cooperation with Turkey. This is if there was a major agreement, but at the same time, without the ability to regain control of this entire area, and I think that's quite far off in this, and therefore any major rapprochement, I think it could have major implications on the border area, politically, socially, economically, and also demographically. I conclude that on that note, Seda.
Thank you very much, Armenak. If the speakers do not have, the presenters do not have any further comments, I would like to move on to the question posed by the audience about the Russian objection to aid. But Sinan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I want to bring in some additional information and insight on the IDP movement within Syria. Based on the early assessment, around the majority, around 90% of the buildings that has been damaged by the earthquake are buildings that have been built by private contractors, whereas the buildings that have been built by Syrian NGOs or INGOs as an upgrade of shelter units for IDPs has mostly been spared. Why is this information is important? Because it means that it is the Syrians that are a little bit more comfortable inside of Idlib and northern Aleppo that have been impacted by the earthquake. So they are the ones who either are afford renting or buying a new house in one of these new complexes. And here we can see two different reactions. The first one is a lot of them camps just next to their homes to make sure that no one is going to basically to steal their positions, to make sure that they can return. Also, in case there is an assistance being distributed in the area. And then there are the other kind of reaction, which is we find a lot of people moving next to community compounds from their previous cities. Like, for example, we saw a lot of Homsis who were around Genderes and around Afrin that moved next to Jarablos. Why? Because Jarablos hosts the biggest Homsi community of IDPs. Same goes also from people from Eastern Ghouta have moved also from Genderes and Afrin to Al Bab, where the Eastern Ghouta's community is also larger and bigger. So these are the two types of reactions that we've been witnessing in terms of IDP movement within Syria. This could impact a little bit the pattern of IDPs of where they reside in Syria moving forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other additional comments? No? So then let me pose the question by the audience. It's about the Russian objection to aid, and the objection is based on a report due by the UN Secretary General. So did the UN Secretary General complete the report on aid, or is it still pending? Any comments on this question? Yes, Emma, please, go ahead.
In the renewal of the cross-border resolution on the 10th of January, I think it was renewed on the 9th of January for the 10th of January, that report from the Secretary General is due on the 10th of June. So it is not due at this point. It is due in a couple of months. So that's up to update about the needs. They have the Russian objection is not the report that is due. They have many objections, some of which, the majority of which are not based on facts. But we also have, they've asked for an update, a continued sort of report on through these dialogues as part of the last couple of renewals on the progress around cross-line and the progress around early recovery programming in regime areas. Which is kind of a poison chalice, because we know that cross-line operationally accounts for, I think it's 0.4% of the assistance required to the Northwest. So even with the best will in the world, that is not operationally, is never going to get to the point where it's operationally significant to meet the needs in that area. And of course, after the first week of the quake, we've had holdups on access for cross-line into the Northwest for the reasons that I outlined in my earlier comments. And then, of course, the early recovery work is progressing. There's a huge amount of early recovery work has been happening in those areas as well. So they have been demanding an update on that. It's basically a way they have sort of baked in these methods to kind of ensure that some of these benefits they have negotiated for regime areas are monitored, and also just to sort of create additional work. I mean, it's certainly not the basis of their objections. But yeah, 10th of June. But hopefully nobody will wait until then to renew that resolution, because we absolutely cannot wait that long.
Thank you very much, Emma. So we are approaching to the end of our panel on the Syrian-Turkish border in the aftermath of the earthquake, which is a natural disaster as much as a political disaster. I mean, the political aspect, as all the presenters have argued, have just deepened the scale and the level of destruction of the natural earthquake disaster. And in this panel, we talked about, I mean, the presenters presented various aspects of the tragedy, the humanitarian response, the movement, the displacements, the IDPs, mainly in northwestern Syria, and their particular movements and their new residences, the sites that they stay. It also, of course, it led to a huge dispersal of population in Turkey as well. Somehow spontaneous, somehow also organized by the aid agency, state's aid agency. And we also heard about how the recent political reapproachment between Turkey and the Syrian, the Turkish and the Syrian regimes gave way to, led to the emergence of new, new social and economic developments, potentially lead to the emergence of new social and political developments in the region, and how the process of rapprochement between these two regimes after the earthquake has been changed, with Assad's position becoming relatively stronger thanks to the successful earthquake diplomacy that he did, while Erdogan's position weakening slightly, though, with given the the size of the destruction and inadequate relief efforts in the aftermath of the quake. And so we tried to present a general atmosphere both in Turkey and in northwestern Syria, and also the earthquake victims, both the Turkish locals and the Syrians, and how the earthquake basically deepened the existing cleavages in the between the between the Turkish locals and the Syrian refugees, and how it increased the economic inequalities inside Turkey as well as in northwestern Syria, and how actually the aid and donation as well as relief efforts have become more centralized on the Turkish part of the border, whereas getting more decentralized still in northwestern part of Syria. So the effects of this of the earthquake are going to, I think, resonate more and more in different forms in the coming days, and we will surely have other occasions to discuss the effects and the new social forces and new social actors that emerge in the process. Thank you very much again for joining us, and I hope that we all witness more hopeful and better days in the coming days. Thank you very much to all the presenters for their valuable presentations.
Thank you, Seda. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.